My name is Rebecca Curry, and I'm the Public Services Supervisor in ESU Special Collections and Archives, which, along with the William Allen White Community Partnership, is hosting our program this afternoon. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Roger Heineken. He's an Atchison County native who enrolled at what was then Kansas State Teachers College in 1969 and earned a BFA in Arts. And he's now retired from a career at ESU. In 2004, he was invited to join the William Allen White Community Partnership and currently chairs the program committee. And he enjoys learning about and sharing Emporia's history and the legacy of the Sage of Emporia, which is what he's here to do today. Roger.
Thank you, Rebecca, and it's good to see you all. The quote that I've had up on the screen here is from an editorial in the Gazette on Friday before the big hoopla on the Tuesday, the 11th of July, 1950. Eugene Lowther wrote that editorial. Some of you may have known him. February is the shortest month of the year, and yet in that month there are three important Emporia dates. One is the founding of Emporia on February the 20th, 1857 in territorial Kansas. We jump to the 15th of February, which is the date that we celebrate Founders Day for ESU. The city itself is in its 166th year on the 20th. ESU is celebrating 160 years this year. And then we go to February 10th, which is William Allen White's birthday in 1868. This year is the 155th year of his birth. And so with that in mind, and noting that William Allen White was one of the most prominent citizens in not only Emporia, but also Kansas, the William Allen White Partnership, which supports the Red Rock State Historic Site, has been programming in and around White's birthday each year, going back several years before the pandemic. And so today is our celebration of White's 155th anniversary. This story is what I consider a braid. It's a project of the local citizenry who worked for 6 years and 5 months from idea to dedication to build a suitable memorial to commemorate the life of our most prominent citizen. And so reading news clippings and letter exchanges, it became pretty complex to understand. So for this program, I've decided to break it out into strands. So we'll be hopping back and forth through time, but I put dates on many of the slides we'll see that hopefully will help you follow along with the story. I want to thank the ESU Special Collections and Archives. Sherry and her staff, Sherry Scribner and her staff, were instrumental in acquiring documents from the Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa, the Library of Congress. We've used materials from the Lyon County Historical Society. The Rindhams supplied some of our content. And we also have a photo or two from the Anderson collection, which is part of the Archives and Special Collections. So with that, we'll move into an editorial comment on my part. As I've learned more and more about Emporia's early history, I've come to have a real appreciation for our community. Going back to the town company that founded our city, they had a clear vision of what they wanted this town to be. They wanted it to be successful, and they worked hard to make that happen. Kansas is littered with ghost towns, especially in the eastern half of the state, and those are the failed communities that didn't flourish. Preston Plum was the only founder of the town company that lived in Emporia, but the 4 others that lived in Lawrence, Kansas worked to worked to promote our city, to add amenities to it. They worked hard to lobby to get one of the institutions of higher education placed in the town. They had a vision for it to be a trade center and known across the state. In the 1870s, or leading into the 1870s, they lobbied to ensure that we would have rail connections. As a trade center in early Emporia, just to get the things that you couldn't make or grow to Emporia was very costly. And so freight wagons from Leavenworth to Emporia was how we got china and glass and saw blades and all of the things needed to build a town. And then if you look at the challenges in the early days establishing the city, the locust plague, the grasshopper plague in the 1870s challenged our agrarian trade center. And in 1893, there was a major panic or depression that challenged Emporia. But in 1895, William Allen White bought the Gazette. He was in debt for that purchase and knew the role of a town editor of a newspaper was to boost the town. So in a short time, leading business people, including William Allen White, got together to form the Businessmen's Association to combat the panic of 1893. That eventually morphed into our Chamber of Commerce. We're talking about the 1800s here. They started the street fairs with headliners. The first of those was in 1898 when they contracted with the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show and Congress of Rough Riders of the World to be a attraction for people in the hinterlands to come in and see this wildly popular program. They negotiated with the railroads that were connected to Emporia for inexpensive excursion tickets so that people from all over the area could come in and see this headliner. And of course, while we're in Emporia, we'll drop a few dollars buying supplies and provisions to take home with us on that cheap train ticket. The next generation of Emporians worked to overcome the elements of the Great Depression, solving issues of unemployment in Emporia. They came together during World War II with home front support for the war effort. And so this effort to build a memorial for the William Allen White legacy is another good example that's still with us today, where people came together and worked for the good of our community. And so I'm proud of that. And I think it would change probably after World War II, we had the Committee of 50, and then things started to change. And when I say that, the Committee of 50 was trying to develop industrial employment for returning veterans and so forth. But Emporia changed at that time where before then, virtually all the businesses in Emporia, save for the university and the railroad, the owners of those businesses lived right here in town. So they were invested in the success of our town because it's their home. And then that all started to change. And I also want to point out that for this particular time, which would be basically January of 1944 to July of 1950, it was a time before internet, it was a time before TV, it was a time before we had diversions that kept us from being a socially engaged community. And I think there's some slides that'll show some of that as we go forward. Some of you may not be familiar with William Allen White's story, so I'm going to give you a Cliff Notes version. And Cliff Notes are even antiquated now with the internet. William Allen White was born in Emporia on February the 10th at 628 Merchant Street. If you can picture that, that's the Hereford building today. That's due east of the post office. And I think it's fortuitous or whatever that that address is only a block and a half from where he conducted his 49-year career. Shortly after he was born, by maybe 1 year of age, the family decided to move to El Dorado. His father was Dr. Allen White, who had trained as a medical doctor, and his mother was early in her career a school teacher. Dr. Allen White was a Democrat, and Mary Ann Hatton White was a Republican. She was a Lincoln Republican who had been in the audience for the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate at Knox College, and forever after then was a dedicated supporter of Lincoln's and his philosophies and that form of political thinking. William Allen White had a younger brother, Freddie, born in El Dorado, but he died in infancy. So William Allen White was the only son of older parents who were educated, had different points of view, and from early in his life he was probably empowered to think deeply about things different than many children in this part of the state. Beverly Buller Olson, in her youth biography of William Allen White, says that William Allen White would be sent off to walk to Sunday school, but being an only child, he had a tendency to attend Sunday school, but then he would go to other churches to attend other Sunday schools to hang out with children of his own age. I think that as an early trait that stayed with William Allen White through his life, he was a gadfly. He was interested in people, and you can see that from the earliest part of his life. The Whites operated a hotel. Their home was like a hotel in El Dorado called the White House, and also they lodged significant people passing through this part of the state, including some of the suffragists. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton stayed with them in El Dorado. William Allen White's father was mayor of Emporia when he died suddenly, unexpectedly, which left William Allen White, young Willie White, as a only child in a single-parent household. In El Dorado, Thomas Benton Murdoch ran the El Dorado Republican newspaper, and of course would have been associated and well known to the White family. And so he gave William Allen White his first job in newspaper work, working in the El Dorado newspaper. William Allen White eventually finished high school in El Dorado and transferred to the new College of Emporia here in town. He made friends with Vernon Kellogg at the school, who was the son of Lyman B. Kellogg, the first president of Emporia State, KSN. And so they became fast friends. Vernon was an aspiring, bright person who wanted to become a scientist and wanted to transfer to the University of Kansas. And William Allen White transferred with him to attend KU. Both of them joined Phi Delta Theta fraternity at KU. Then it was only about 4 years old. But among the members of the fraternity then were future governors of states, political figures, other scientific people, several business leaders, and Frederick Funston, who would become a Medal of Honor winner in the Spanish-American War later on. William Allen White was also a very good and close friend of General Funston. So late in his senior year, Thomas Benton Murdoch, who ran the paper in El Dorado, wanted someone to run the daily operations of the paper and invited William Allen White to be the managing editor of that paper. And so White left KU without a degree to do that. In time, White eventually moved to Kansas City, where he started working for newspapers in the area. The second was the Kansas City Star, where he was involved with editing and contributing to the opinion page in the Kansas City Star. While in Kansas City, he met Sally Moss Lindsay, started courting her, and eventually would marry her in 1893. He worked for the Star for a couple more years and had also been writing poetry, which became his first published book. It was co-authored with Albert Bigelow Payne, who was a photographic equipment salesman in Fort Scott, and together they self-published their book of poetry called Rhyme of Two Friends. Now, it turns out that Albert Bigelow Payne was a real cad and a man of low character, a bigamist. Of course, White didn't know all that when they started having squabbles about sharing the revenue from their book. But Bigelow Payne moved to New York and eventually was the literary executor for Mark Twain. So how do people in frontier Kansas connect with all of these people who go on to do great things? Sally and William Allen White started thinking, well, maybe we should buy our own newspaper. And so they looked around at newspapers that were available to purchase and settled on Emporia, the Emporia Gazette, which was a Democrat-leaning newspaper. It was founded in 1890 and in 5 years had 2 owners. And so William Allen White and Sally borrowed $3,000 to buy the Gazette, and he moved here in June of 1895 to take over the operation of that paper. The luck or talent or whatever you want to call it is such that 16 months after he bought the newspaper, he wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, attacking the populist political point of view, which was really centered in the Midwest, Kansas and Nebraska in particular. And that piece was published in the Gazette and then picked up by other newspapers in the nation. It was pamphletized by the Republican Party and considered an important element in the McKinley campaign for president. And so after that national exposure through his writing, he was offered lucrative contracts to do feature articles in magazines, for publication in newspapers, and in other platforms of that day. He was offered lots of money to move to the East Coast, but he chose not to do that. He felt his voice remained unique if he were speaking from the heartland, as opposed to joining the ranks of all the journalists writing with a perspective from the East Coast. And so his notoriety and prominence was growing virtually year by year. He could maintain a national career because we had the main line of the Santa Fe Railroad, running right through Emporia. He could hop a train and go to Washington, D.C. or New York. From that initial what's the matter with Kansas, he met Teddy Roosevelt, who was vice president when McKinley was assassinated, and was taken by Teddy Roosevelt's energy and persona and commitment to public service. In many ways, like his mother was taken by Abraham Lincoln. They remained friends through the course of Roosevelt's life, and William Allen White's political point of view moderated over the course of years, and he became a progressive, which was so different from his point of view at the time that he wrote the What's the Matter with Kansas editorial. He acquired the moniker of Sage of Emporia before 1928, when he was in his 50s or so. A lot of, he and Sally had William Lindsay White in 1900, and then Mary White was born in 1904. And as his fame and finances shifted dramatically, so different than other editors of small Midwestern newspapers, he was able to pay off his debt to the newspaper in pretty short time. And that freed his pen, where he wasn't beholden to carry the water of the banker that held the note on the newspaper. He was able to eventually rent and then buy Red Rocks for $6,000 in 1901. In 1900, he built his new Gazette building, and I've never seen a price for that construction. In 1901, he bought the Red Rocks for $6,000, and so all of this was on the strength of his talent, his point of view, and he continued to publish regularly books in all genres, from novels to collections of short stories and policy tomes. Of course, we all know, if you've grown up in Emporia, that tragedy struck the family in 1921 when Mary suffered a head injury while riding her horse, and their beloved 16-year-old daughter died. That prompted William Allen White to write the Mary White editorial, which turned out to be so heart-rendering and moving. It was picked up by newspapers across the country. It was read on air and early radio. It appeared in magazines and periodicals. Then it was included in a textbook anthology of short-form writing that Christopher Morley put out. The Whites quit keeping track of the royalty income on that publication for 20 years after Mary died. It was in print even longer than that. Roger Heineken, some of you may have known him, he said in 1958 he was using a textbook in high school that still included the Mary White editorial. So the 16-year-old daughter had a certain kind of immortality because of her father's talent. William Allen White was kind of a pundit sitting on the sidelines until his mother died, who had been an activist for suffrage as well as civil rights. Mary was already showing great civic engagement. And so White had been kind of a pundit, opining about affairs of the city, the state, and the nation. But he started to actually turn words into deeds. So when the Klan infiltrated Kansas out of Oklahoma, and none of the political leadership in our state was denouncing them, he filed for governor to run on an anti-Klan platform. He also became a champion of free speech. And in 1922, when the railroad strike was creating violent protests and issues, the governor, Henry Allen, his friend, had made an executive order that barred people from supporting the strikers. And William Allen White felt that that violated the First Amendment. So he wrote an editorial entitled "To an Anxious Friend," which turned out to receive a Pulitzer Prize. He became the first Kansan to win a Pulitzer, and would win another one for his unfinished but published posthumously his autobiography. Interestingly, Emporia had two figures that received Pulitzer Prizes. Vernon Parrington at the College of Emporia also received a Pulitzer. So White was doing things standing on principle that more and more people, I think, started to respect. And I would back up to his taking over the Gazette. Most newspapers in the Midwest had a political leaning, Democrat or Republican. William Allen White had a political leaning to the Republican point of view, but unlike most of the newspapers, he allowed opposing points of view to be published. And so on the editorial page, he would alternate pro-issue voices and con voices, and that built trust in the citizenship of Emporia, that even though he might take a stance on an issue on the editorial page with an editorial, all citizens had a voice in this newspaper. Within a short time, after 1895, where the city was served by 3 newspapers, the Gazette was the only newspaper in town, because people who had democratic point of views chose to subscribe to the Gazette because they felt they were being treated fairly, and a lot of towns didn't have that. William Allen White continued to serve. He had the ear of at least 5 presidents because of his notoriety, and that would go from Teddy Roosevelt up through FDR, and became kind of a senior statesman and voice from the heartland. So we'll talk about his passing. On January the 29th, which is Kansas Day, in the day that Kansas entered the state as the 34th state in the Union, William Allen White died. He had cancer, and his death was imminent. I think most people in town knew that, but he did die. His body lay in state at the house, Red Rocks, and because of his fame and notoriety in the nation, Life magazine covered his funeral. And these are 2 photos from that. He had been a trustee of the College of Emporia for much of his adult life, and so the funeral was held in Kenyon Hall on the campus of College of Emporia. The audience was much larger than the auditorium, and so loudspeakers were erected outside of the building for the audience that was gathered on the lawn. In 1944, the mayor was Ora Rendham. He was the manager of Riverside Gardens, and the family had been longtime residents, citizens of Emporia. The mugshot you see is probably from the late 20s or early 30s, before he was mayor, but the group photo shows him in the dark overcoat. So within a week of the funeral, Mayor Rendham sent a letter to approximately 12 leading citizens asking to meet to consider what might be done to honor the Sage of Emporia. I have not found a list of who was invited or who actually attended, but I suspect that with the funeral having just existed the week before, William Lindsay White was probably one of the people invited to that first meeting. So along with what we were trying to do in Emporia to honor the Sage of Emporia, the War Department, and of course World War II was underway at this time, the War Department named a Liberty ship for William Allen White, the USS William Allen White. It was launched from the Permanente shipyards in California, and it was May of 1944 when it was launched with a bottle of champagne cracked across its bow. It served in the war, which was Pacific theater basically, until after the war. It was sold to the nation of Sweden and used as a weather ship, and was eventually scrapped in 1967. In 1945, Lyon County had raised enough money through war bond drives to have naming rights for a B-29, a Boeing B-29 bomber. And so Wichita, of course, was a major supplier of aircraft for World War II. And our citizens, knowing that their plane, named for William Allen White, would be test flown from Wichita to Forbes Field in Topeka, depoted there for crews that trained across the United States to come in and take command of the B-29, and that the crew that would fly our namesake plane would be this close. They arranged with the War Department to have that crew come to Emporia, to be introduced at the Civic Auditorium at another war bond rally, and also to meet Sally White, the widow of the namesake of their plane. I think that this crew is probably the only 11-man crew in the history of World War II to have visited the town, met the widow of the namesake of their plane. And many planes had names. So I think that's unique. In 2007, of the 11-man crew that visited here, 5 were still living, and 3 of them attended a bombardment group reunion in Wichita to see the B-29 that was being refurbished and restored. And so we reached out to them and invited them back to Emporia 62 years after their first visit. Again, it's a heartwarming idea, but it was a meaningful visit for those 3. Julie Johnson, who I think you were mayor when they were here. The city commission passed a resolution for Reunion Day for the crew of the White and the city of Emporia. They were introduced, that particular weekend was a Children's Book Award weekend, and there were approximately 900 elementary children from across the state of Kansas in the auditorium who unprompted gave them a standing ovation when they were introduced to the crowd. Again, pretty meaningful. Also, Cheryl Unruh, who's in our audience, was writing regular columns for the Gazette at that time and wrote a great editorial about that visit called Victory Lap when they came back to Emporia. Now, they were flying 16-hour missions bombing Japan, and they returned unscathed, unlike some of the other crews in other B-29s. Because of their their success on missions, they were called back to the United States to train for the invasion of Japan, because that was one option, as well as using the A-bomb to end the war. And so they were stateside when the Japan surrendered to end World War II. The William Allen White stayed in the South Pacific on Tinian Island with other crews flying it. And the William Allen White bomber accompanied the Enola Gay on the mission to drop the atomic bomb. Unlike the Liberty ship, the William Allen White B-29 was scrapped immediately after the war. It went to Texas to a boneyard where it just sat and eventually was probably dismantled for recycled purposes. In 1944, the Board of Regents named the journalism department at KU for William Allen White. And along with that, there's a second William Allen White Foundation that supports the journalism school there. Today it's the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communication. So here we're starting to unwind this braid now. So February of -- is when Ora Rendon called the first meeting of civic leaders. The meetings continue with some regularity, and more businessmen and stakeholders in the success of Emporia joined in. And by joining in, we're talking about making contributions to a new foundation that was formed here in Emporia to receive the donations for the memorial. Our memorial, our foundation is called the William Allen White Emporia Memorial Foundation, different than the William Allen White Foundation at KU. Sometime during the course of the year in those meetings, they decided to commission a bust of William Allen White as a centerpiece for some kind of memorial. By 1948, 67 people had donated to that fund, and of those, 63 of them were from right here in Emporia. In 1948, fundraising had been vigorous and successful, and of an amount that they believed they could fulfill this memorial. And so, knowing that they were on a track to success, they decided to, or started to discuss the possibility of opening it to everyone, so that anyone in Emporia could be a member of the foundation for as little as a penny. And particularly, they were wanting to include children. They wanted children to feel like they could be a part of it. Part of that was because they knew that whatever they created would be passed to a new generation who would respect it. And they also knew that White was very appreciative of children and their contribution to what we are as a community, and always supported children. Probably even more so after his own daughter died. By May of 1949, the fund was around the $25,000 mark. And if you make that into equivalent dollars for today, that's about $307,000. Again, when William Lindsay White was in town, I'm sure he was consulted every step of the way with this to have family input. But William Lindsay White and Catherine maintained a home in a brownstone in New York City. They owned a farm outside of New York in New Jersey, and they had a duplex apartment just north of Red Rocks here. And so they were always going back and forth to the different places. So I'm sure William Lindsay White was at some of the meetings, but also was kept apprised of the work of this group. So they're discussing opening it up. And so in 1948, they decided to hold a public meeting. First of all, I don't expect you to read all that. And so at this public meeting, where they wanted to test the interest of people in the community to join the foundation. They had 60 people attend a meeting at the Broadview Hotel, and this is a list from the newspaper of all the different groups in Emporia that were there representing altar societies and study clubs and the Girl Scout Council and PEO and DAR and Army Mothers, and it went on and on and on. One thing, again, like we didn't have internet, is that in the 40s, most women were homemakers and stay-at-home moms. But that didn't keep them from being socially engaged in organizations, clubs, and special interest groups that supported what was happening in our town. So I think that's a great to me, it's a great example of how we were socially networked as a community during that time. So planning went forward to open it up, and so in May of 1949, a special William Allen White Memorial Week was planned, and this would have been right before Memorial Weekend holiday. And so children were organized to distribute the invitation to join the foundation, which is at the top part of this slide, to every home in Emporia. So it wasn't like a story in the newspaper. Every home in Emporia got a personalized invitation. The brochure, which was like 4 pages front and back, included this artist rendering of what the memorial might look like as it was thought to be developing for 1949. Now, important along these lines, we had the Victory Ship and we had the Bomber, which continued the legacy after and awareness of White after his death. But William Lindsay White, with Sally's help, finished the incomplete autobiography of William Allen White. It was published in 1926. It became a selection for the Book of the Month Club and won a Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1947. So in the consciousness of the nation, William Allen White's name was still out there. Also, Harry Truman whistle-stopped at the depot in 1948 to sign papers authorizing the issue of a 3-cent stamp, a commemorative stamp for William Allen White. Now, you might notice that the stamp looks a lot like the photo of White in the brochure. And that's because that was a favorite senior statesman photo of the family. And that was around his 70th birthday when former President Herbert Hoover came to visit. So we'll see photos of that as we go forward. Now we're going to start to go into threads. So early on in '44, the group decided they wanted a bust. And they asked William Lindsay White, you know, who do you recommend? Or do you have a recommendation? Well, back in 1919, William Allen White was traveling to Paris for the Versailles Peace Treaty, which was the treaty following World War I. Trying to indoctrinate his son to take over the newspaper, he took 18-year-old William Lindsay White with him. And at that conference, they met Joe Davidson, the sculptor that would eventually make the William Allen White bust we have in Peter Pan Park. In correspondence with Davidson, William Lindsay White, who knew the artist, was the correspondent. And at that time, they didn't know the scale or scope of what that memorial would be. So Davidson's quote for a portrait bust was $5,000. And that's life size. So that was the equivalent of $83 in today's money. Later in '45, when the plans were developing, an oversized over life-size bust was felt that was something on the scale that was needed for the memorial, and that was quoted by Davidson at $10,000. And once the contracts were signed, the agreement was that a third of that $10,000 would be paid at the time of the contracting. At the time the completion of the bust in oil clay was approved, the second third would be paid. And then on delivery of the cast bronze bust, the last payment of a third would be made. By knowing they wanted a bust in 1944, the bust was completed early in 1947, and yet we were dedicating it in 1950. And so it was exhibited at a New York gallery, which was really the first time the public got to see it and know about the project at Emporia. Here's our two photos of the completed oil clay sculpture. This was evidence or proof that it was time to make payment number 2, because Davidson's studio was in Pennsylvania, and the people with the money were in Emporia. And while a lot of people traveled, it was easier to send photos of what I've created here. I want to jump over now to the architect. So Edward Buehler Delk was the architect that designed the memorial. He was born in 1886. He studied at the University of Pennsylvania. During World War I, he was with the Army Air Corps. And then following his military service, he went to the University of London to study architecture and made trips into Spain and into Mexico to study the Spanish style of architecture. After his study, he moved to establish a firm in Kansas City and was a consulting architect with J.C. Nichols, who was starting the Country Club Plaza. Delk and his knowledge of Spanish architecture obviously influenced and contributed to what we know today as Country Club Plaza. In my reading, he, I think, is responsible for the design of 2 buildings on the plaza today, while White and White architect firm designed a lot of the other buildings down in the Country Club Plaza. Also, the landscape architecture firm of Hare and Hare we're working with J.C. Nichols on that large major project. The White and White architecture firm was also designing the redo of Red Rocks after the fire in 1920. And Hare and Hare had been hired by the Whites to landscape the 52 acres of Peter Pan Park. So Delk, arriving in 1920, he would be familiar with his colleagues in architecture who were working on the White House in Emporia, and the landscape firm had already, or in a few years, would be working on Peter Pan Park. So just to follow up on Edward Buehler Delk, Frank Lloyd Wright designed in Kansas City the Community Christian Church. That's a church that has a big beam of light that goes up into the sky. But in a dispute over building codes and materials that were planned by Frank Lloyd Wright that were not resolved. Frank Lloyd Wright abandoned work on the project, and Edward Delp worked to complete that project, finding solutions to the problem that caused Frank Lloyd Wright to abandon it. Now, right after the memorial was designed for our Peter Pan Park, Delp was the design architect for Starlight Theater, 1950 to 51. And again, people were remote. The artist was in Pennsylvania, sculpting William Allen White. The architect was in Kansas City, not too far from Emporia. And so issues for the architect were, well, what size is the bust? And so some of the correspondence includes little sketches and things back and forth, because the architect needs to know exactly what he's designing the bust for. There were efforts for people to get together, and this note that I find very hard to read, this little PS on the letter, says that he's planning to be in Florida, and it sounds like Davidson was going to be in Florida. They were hoping that they could get together and talk in person. This is a time for letters, telegrams, and expensive long-distance phone calls. So there you have it. As Delp's design was evolving, and because the bust was going to be exhibited in a gallery in New York City, they collaborated to come up with a backdrop and a way to display it that would be consistent with the state of the design for the memorial in Peter Pan Park. So these are some illustrations that came about for that exhibit opening. I will say that because William Lindsay White lived in New York and had a farm in New Jersey, they were not very far from the Pennsylvania studio of the sculptor. And they were able to see the bust in oil clay develop and give some tips on how to maybe tweak it. And Bobby Milner's indicated that Catherine told her that Barbara also saw the work in progress, the daughter of William Lindsay and Catherine White, who suggested that the hands might be changed in a certain way to be more like her grandfather. This is a shot in the gallery in April of 1947. Sally White with the artist with the beard, and then Ora Rendon are viewing it in this photo. Also attending was William Lindsay White, also W.K. Calhoun, the owner of Newman's Department Store, was a part of the leadership of this group. And so it was with this public exhibit that people around the country knew about it, the project here in Emporia. And again, the name goes on, William Allen White, Great American, home Emporia, Kansas. So they were learning about it here. William Lindsay White at this gallery exhibit was photographed standing by the bust of his father. That photo appeared in Newsweek magazine. Also in this newspaper, the magazine, the American Press, it was for hometown newspaper editors. There was an article about editors having an opinion on whether it looked like William Allen White or it looked like Ed Howe from Atchison, and of course most editors in Kansas all knew William Allen White personally. And it was probably more of a jocular, poking fun at one another argument than a real issue about it. So the bust was completed, cast in bronze and completed in the spring of 1947. but it would be 3 more years before we install it. So we'll go into a little timeline here now, because there was a question of where are we going to put it. And so early on, President David McFarland, Scotty McFarland, offered the KSTC campus as a site for the memorial. And he took it to the regents, who approved that it be located on the campus. I think this is significant because eventually they would choose to name the White Memorial Library. That was in the funding pipeline a few years later. There were others that thought it should go on the campus of Emporia Senior High School. And that was taken to our Board of Education and was approved there as well. Some thought it should go on the front lawn of the Civic Auditorium. And others thought it should go into an island in the middle of 6th Avenue, which seems strange, but we were much more pedestrian then than we are today. And then there was some consideration of being near the entrance to Peter Pan Park, where the stone gates take you into the park, near one of those two. Architect Delk is the one who came to Emporia and scouted locations and eventually suggested putting it on the lakeshore on axis with Rural Street, so that when you're driving south on South Rural, you view through the boathouse, the pergola, and it would frame the memorial on the far bank. This is one of the about 4 access point, what I consider fine designs at Emporia for positioning. One of those is that Plum Hall and the buildings before it were on axis with Commercial Street. Our country club is on axis with Rural Street. And the First Christian Church over here, the front doors are on axis with Market Street, where the building is prominent and you can view it. Market Street goes one way south now, and people don't notice that. But I think this was an ingenious choice that the committee, the foundation leadership, thought was a good idea. So they were set on that until the taxpayers voted in a referendum to build a new courthouse, which is the one on the corner of 4th and Commercial. However, based on the newspaper clippings, I'm not sure they knew yet where they were going to build it, because they talked about it being next to a school. I'm thinking that might be the high school, which was to the east of the high school, near the Broadview, and the street would be abandoned. And they thought it could go in a landscaped area in the abandoned street. And I didn't go down the rabbit hole of trying to learn more about that to keep this a manageable story. However, that was considered or just brought up as an option after the decision for Peter Pan Park, but Peter Pan Park stuck. So construction begins in May of 1949. Now remember, the money was already basically in the bank to do all of this. Tom Cox and Sons was contracted to build the memorial at a fixed rate, so that was a firm contract of what that would cost. From the very beginning of planning for some kind of memorial or foundation, several businessmen and cattlemen in Chase County offered to provide the limestone. And what they ultimately delivered was dismantled, dry-laid limestone walls out in Chase County. And so that's what we see in the memorial today. 6,000 pounds of flagstone was shipped from Pennsylvania for the decking and the floor. And flagstone is probably the bad word that they used in the newspaper. It's really slate tile from Pennsylvania. the monolith that backs the bust and the capstone of the wall and two benches were of pink sandstone. And I spent a lot of time, we have a geologist in our audience. Is Massasoit sandstone a kind of pink sandstone?
I can't remember seeing it.
Okay. Well, they used a word which I think was misspelled in the newspaper, and I tried to find out more about that, and I couldn't.
It sounds like the lions from Colorado, right?
Okay, well,
Like
at any rate.
Like it's in the Union, in the entrance part of the Union.
That's possible. Possibly it came from Colorado. I never did find out where that stone came from. And the green marble pedestal for the bust, I think was like warehoused in Kansas City until late in 1949. The bronze bust and the two tablets with the edited text of the Mary White editorial were in storage between 1949 and July of 1950. And I suspect, one thing that came to mind and I questioned and thought about is that all the money was in the bank, but yet we had the bronze bust in storage for 3 years, and I think it all hinged on being able to secure the speaker. And so we'll move on. So Herbert Hoover was the first choice to speak at the dedication. He was a longtime friend of William Allen White, and just a little bio background. He was born in West Branch, Iowa in 1874 into a Quaker family. He was orphaned as a child, and he moved to Oregon to join the family of relatives in Oregon. He was bright, obviously, and very with great potential, and so he entered in the first class at Stanford University, graduating in 1895. Now we have to jump back to our social networks story, because one of his favorite professors at Stanford was Vernon Kellogg, William Allen White's fraternity brother, and an academic who was an entomologist by discipline. And so they became faculty student, but also good friends there. Now, a little aside to William Allen White. In January of 1913, Mr. and Mrs. White occasionally would have emotional or mental exhaustion from working so hard on books and editorials and meeting everyone, and their whole life was one I couldn't keep up with. So the doctor suggested they go away for an extended vacation. And so the Whites rented a beach house in La Jolla, California, and took the children out of school and lived on the beach in California for 6 months. Okay, remember I told you that William Allen White was a gadfly, and his best friend was a faculty at Stanford? So, do you think he hopped a train to go visit his best friend? Of course he did. And though Hoover was not a student in 1913, I'm sure that's where he heard of Hoover for the first time, talking to Vernon Kellogg there. He also met David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford, who himself was an academic, and he was a ichthyologist that taught there, but he was president of the school. Thomas Butcher comes to be president of KSTC in 1913, then called Normal School. And in 1914, William Allen White's back in town. He's a confidant of the president. White and Butcher would talk about higher ed issues, and that might inform an editorial about higher education. So the old science hall, which sat in front of Roosevelt Hall over here, had always been generic Science Hall, but they wanted to honor Norton, who was the second faculty at Emporia State, and who should be the keynote speaker for naming that building but David Starr Jordan from Stanford. And I almost bet that Butcher asked William Allen White any suggestions on who he might get to speak. And William Allen White said, well, why don't we get the president of Stanford? He's a friend of Kellogg, whose father was the first president of Emporia State. And David Starr Jordan spoke at the dedication of the Norton Science Hall. Okay, back on Hoover. So out of school, he trained as a mining engineer and worked very successfully in China and other nations, streamlining mining production, and actually became wealthy before he turned to public service. So during World War I, the agricultural and food production in Europe was screwed up because of the war. And Hoover was tapped to operate or administer the Belgian relief program until 1917, at which point he jumped to Director of U.S. Food Administration yet before the end of the war to champion and administer our domestic food production for our own citizens, but also to help our allies in Europe and also support our military overseas. And then he eventually transitioned to be tapped as the Secretary of Commerce. And so he did that from 1921 to 1928. And then he was running for president. And William Allen White hosted a lawn dinner at Red Rocks, the center photo, for the newspaper editors all across eastern half of Kansas and into the western edge of Missouri to meet the Secretary of Commerce, who was throwing his hat in the ring for president. And so that's how they, how he supported Hoover in Emporia. Hoover had also visited Emporia other times, stayed at the Guffler Mansion at one point, visited the Whites with regularity, and of course William Allen White would have seen him out of Emporia on other occasions. But anyway, he was president from 1929 to 1933, and of course the Great Depression struck. So, I need to back or go forward here. I thought I had changed these. So they reached out to Hoover, tried to secure him for 1948 dedication. However, he had had a health issue and was not traveling as he was convalescing. So that delayed plans for his involvement. Hoover lived in an apartment in a hotel in downtown New York and maintained a home in Palo Alto near Stanford. And so a healthy lifestyle meant that he traveled several times a year between those two homes. And the idea was to coordinate with his travel schedule to stop in Emporia, deliver the address, and then move on to his destination. So the plan was to be in Peter Pan Park. The public and everybody and their brother was invited. The municipal band was planned to do a 45-minute concert. At 8:30, Governor Frank Carlson was to introduce Hoover for that event. And the speech would be delivered in the amphitheater at the park at 9:30. It was going to be broadcast live to the nation on CBS radio, and the newspaper clippings indicated that the committee was going to de-chigger the grass in Peter Pan Park. I presume that was dusting the lawn picnic areas with sulfur, which is a deterrent for chiggers. And then they were going to install special lighting to illuminate because that late at 9:30, it would be getting dark, to illuminate the amphitheater and also illuminate how people might move back to their cars at the conclusion of the event. They had lined up Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, City Police, Sheriff, Highway Patrol, and National Guard to control traffic. I think the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts were going to show people how to park in the pasture, probably to the west of Peter Pan Park. So between Friday of the 7th of July and the day of the event, Emporia got a 3.5-inch rain, which rendered the park a mire of mud. And so early on, they had planned to have the Civic Auditorium as a backup, so that was no surprise. They had encouraged people to picnic in the park, but an organization called Farm Wives served food in the basement of the Civic Auditorium, and newspaper clippings say that 100 families were served in the basement before the speech. Now, because of the schedule for Hoover, and the Santa Fe Railroad was involved in this, because passenger service timetables and schedules changed in the weeks leading up to the event. So the speech that was planned for 9:30 got moved to 8 o'clock. Well, CBS could no longer broadcast the speech live, so ABC radio was who carried the speech nationwide. The parking was still an issue, so what had been planned was just relocated to a different thing. Newspaper stories asked the citizens to groom their lawns so they look presentable, because a lot of out-of-town people would be coming. How do I go back? So Hoover arrived with this new revised schedule. Hoover arrived in Emporia at noon on the 11th, on his way to Palo Alto, to his home on the West Coast. He was met at the train, went to Red Rocks to rest, have lunch. In the afternoon, they took him to Peter Pan Park to see the memorial. And the newspaper article about that said that he had to step over mud puddles to get down to the memorial to view it. All the living editors who had attended the 1927 lawn party were invited to a dinner hosted by the White family at the country club for the guest speaker, but also these editors who previously, 23 years before, had met the candidate and ultimate president. And they also wanted to recognize and honor every single person who had been a primary officer or served as a committee chair for various aspects in the planning and dedication program situation that they were about to experience. So in the newspaper clipping, these are names that were mentioned. Ora Rhythm, the mayor then, when it started, W.K. Calhoun of Newman's, Harold Tressler of our Tressler Foundation was a major player, and other people there. Elmer Seidoff was the manager of the Broadview Hotel, and that, after they opened it to everyone, you could drop by the lobby of the hotel and make a penny donation to join the foundation. This is the printed program before they knew they had to change locations. But this program does indicate that in case of weather issues, it would be in the auditorium. Okay, the day after the speech, the New York Times had a story in there about Hoover's address. The audience and several news clippings said that 5,000 people attended the speech. I think that's standing room only, and probably violates what today would be occupancy limits for fire issues, but we did have the fire department in the basement, so I think they were safe. In 1950, Emporia's population was 15,669. So roughly, an audience of a third of our population attended. Now, 15 days before the speech, North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the United States and allied countries. And the fighting would end in 1953. So President Hoover's speech was entitled "The United Nations and World Peace." And so later today, I've got a few copies of the text of that speech if you'd like to pick that up when we end the program. So July 11, the memorial was dedicated, and on December 19th, 1950, Sally Moss Lindsay dies. But she died knowing that a elementary school across the street from her house would be named for William Allen White. She attended she had broken her hip in 1949 and probably had mobility issues, but she attended the speech and all the affairs related to the dedication. And by that time in 1950, she knew that a new library would be built on the KSTC campus, and the Regents had chosen the name William Allen White. Probably because they had been engaged early on in the location of the memorial, and it was a kind of a no-brainer to honor a major Kansan. A year later, at the annual meeting of the foundation in 1951, there was discussion of what do we do now. And so several of the ideas that were thrown out included creating a scholarship program, and other ideas included an annual lecture series, a clinic for children, the William Allen White Clinic for Children, and there was discussion about the William Allen White Memorial Drive that we remember. And so I believe this sign is actually, at one time, was posted on the route for the Memorial Drive. And I didn't go deeper to find out what happened to the foundation many years later. So there's the access point from Earl Street, viewing through the pergola and across the lake at the memorial. Now we'll do a quick run through on our sculptor, Joe Davidson. He was born in New York City in 1883. He studied art in France in 1907. In France, he married a French fashion designer. He came back to the United States, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, heir to the Gilded Age families, became his first patron. She herself was a sculptor, but she helped introduce him to a larger, affluent audience who might order portrait busts. He had his first one-man show in 1911 in New York. He maintained studios at his wife's, at a farm in Lahaska, PA, halfway between Philadelphia and New York City. He had a studio in Paris, and he had a studio at his wife's home in the Loire Valley of France. And the estate was called Becheron, I believe. I'm sure starting out, he didn't have all those studios, but at the time he was being commissioned to do the bust of William Allen White. He had that. So, Joe Davidson's grandson, Laureate Davidson, is a sculptor today. He does mobiles and stabiles like Calder. And he has a great page honoring his grandfather on his artist website. So everything we'll see here now in the next few slides are from that. So this is a photo of Becheron in France. and an interior shot of a studio there. Pardon me. This is a shot of Charlie Chaplin, the silent movie great, with his bust in profile. I learned that in reading about Joe Davidson, unlike most sculptors, he did not have living subjects sit for these portraits. These photos that we'll see here are probably publicity promotion to show likeness of the bust with the figure. and of course, someone was paying for that, so he may have been coming in to approve it when those photos were taken. We have John D. Rockefeller. There's quite a likeness there. I don't know if he gave Davidson a penny or not, or a dime, I mean. This is Gertrude Stein, and I presume this is in the Paris studio. This is Helen Keller viewing her bust. And then the state of Oklahoma commissioned a posthumous full-body sculpture of Will Rogers. One appears in Statuary Hall in D.C., and the other one is in the State House in Oklahoma. And he also did Robert La Follette, who was a legislator, and he has a full-body sculpture in Statuary Hall as well. He did several FDR busts and heads. This is a monumental head that is on I believe in a New York memorial that honors FDR. And I believe this is the Pennsylvania studio. This is Arthur Conan Doyle with a younger Davidson. And this is Eisenhower. I don't think this actually looks as much like Eisenhower as the photo shows. There's Frank Sinatra. What Davidson would do, rather than have people sit, he would sit down and talk with them and watch their mannerisms, their behaviors, learn more about them, see how they smiled, see how they cocked their head, and he was able to absorb that and come pretty close to the finished product when he was done. He tended to be much more expressive with those kinds of sculptures than if he were working from photos of historic figures. And so when he was at the Paris Peace Conference, he was actually commissioned to do a lot of the major European figures in World War I when he was there. And that's how the whites met him originally. So this is an edited list of some of the figures that he sculpted, but he did many, many more. James Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, the whites are believed to have met James Barrie in 1909 when they took their first grand tour of Europe. The whites knew Madame Chiang Kai-shek. Clarence Darrow and William Allen White served as national directors of the NAACP in the 1930s. Albert Einstein and William Allen White received honorary degrees at Harvard in 1935. Henry Luce was the founder of the photojournal magazine Life, and as you noted, they covered William Allen White's life late in his career. John Barron was a painter and friend of Murdoch Pemberton, who had worked for William Allen White and grew up in Emporia. Carl Sandburg spoke and read poetry at Emporia on several occasions. It's possible White knew them. Lincoln Steffen was one of the muckrakers of McClure's magazine, for which William Allen White contributed feature articles from time to time. The Whites are believed to have met H.G. Wells in England in 1909. And of course, William Allen White knew Woodrow Wilson. There's a permanent Joe Davidson exhibit in the National Portrait Gallery with 14 works that are on exhibit there. So he's still respected for the work he did in his lifetime. Joe Davidson did this toward the last 5 or 6 years of his life. He published his autobiography in 1951, and then he died in 1952. Here's a picture of Hoover after jumping puddles to go see the bust at the brand new memorial in Peter Pan Park. And then in 2016, this memorial had been a target of vandals, age, mildew on the stone, a lot of problems, and the city had it restored to, it looks great today. Here's a 1982 photo across a frozen lake. Apparently, at one time we had a sign there that noted and credited Davidson as a sculptor, and when the memorial was dedicated. I don't believe there's anything like that there now. And Life magazine came to Emporia in late 1938 to cover William Allen White's 70th birthday. And since this is a birthday program, I thought I'd include this photo. And this cracks me up every time I see it. You have an almost 70-year-old man trying to blow out 70 taper candles on a cake. So William Allen White was windy, but not that way. So I sculpted a bust of William Allen White, a head. I mentioned William Allen White was find out at KU. So in 1986, we had a generic newsletter award for the best newsletter among chapters across the nation. And I thought, well, okay, communicating with your alumni, that really could be named for William Allen White, a famous member of our fraternity. So that was pitched up the line, it was approved, and I tried my hand at sculpting oil clay to create this terrible likeness of William Allen White. But it was first awarded in '87, and it's still running today. Now with the technology changes, it's called Excellence in Communication, and that's encompassing internet and websites and the whole bit. So that is my program. I mentioned that we have a few copies of the speech, the text of the speech, and if you'd like those, you're welcome to get that. And I'd entertain questions if you have any, and I can answer them. Okay, well, yes, sir.
When did the Whites acquire their residence in Estes Park?
They bought that. I mentioned that. I mentioned that William Allen White and Sally often had like nervous exhaustion. So when they were told to take a long vacation and they went to California, right before they left for California, they bought the cabin in Colorado. And while they were gone, it was to be rehabbed and modernized and brought up to date. And so from that date until Barbara donated it to the National Park Service, it was their home. And when our site first opened, we had a 90-year-old grandson of a governor who toured the house on a bus tour. And he had never been to Red Rocks, but he had been to the cabin in Colorado. So, you know, during the dog days of summer in Kansas, William Allen White would often take a month off, go to the cabin at higher altitude and cooler, more accommodating temperatures, which is where he would work on his major books, and he didn't have the distraction there. And he and Sally could maybe chill out a little bit because their life was pretty hectic back here. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, and happy birthday, William Allen White.